Okay, so welcome everybody. Today we're here to talk about water project grants and loans and irrigation modernization funding. My name is Adair Ruth. I'm the grant coordinator at OWRD. And with me today is Lisa Kingsley, our grant analyst, Kim Fritz Hilgren, the manager of the planning collaboration and investment section, and Lily Prawl, our planning coordinator. So before I dive in, we have a lot to talk about today. So we have 7 sections and then an opportunity for questions at the end. We have a lot to cover, but we also have plenty of time for questions. So first, we're just going to talk a little bit about the planning collaboration investment section within WRD. We'll give you some background on these funding opportunities, talk about some of the specific requirements that are associated with these funding opportunities. Then we'll talk about application scoring and specifically on the public benefits. We'll talk about how to apply. We have some application tips for you. Then we'll give you a little bit about information about OWRD grants if you are successful with the grant application, and then have time for questions. As you can see, we're covering a lot, so we would ask that we save questions to the end, but if you have any clarifying things as we're going through this presentation, you're welcome to add that to the chat as well. So diving right in, the planning, collaboration, and investments section within WRD is a small but growing section in our department. And the purpose of PCI, as we call it for short, is to build partnerships and incentivize Oregonians to pursue integrated and innovative solutions for complex water challenges and an uncertain water future. And we do this by the 5 things that are on the bottom of the slide, including strategic investments. Our strategic investments include these 3 grant programs. We have place-based planning, which is to plan and identify actions. And this was a pilot program, but just became a permanent program in the 2023 legislative session. So we're really excited that Lily will be standing this grant program up as a permanent program. We also have feasibility study grants. This grant program is to provide funding to investigate the feasibility of projects. And then we have water project grants and loans, which is our funding program to implement projects. But additionally, our grant portfolio is a little bit bigger. We also have a couple of grant programs for wells. So we have the Well Abandonment Repair and Replacement Fund, which is a statewide fund to help individuals with dry wells. And we are also working on standing up the Harney Domestic Well Remediation Fund, which will be launched in 2024. And then we, as of the 2023 legislative session, have some funding for irrigation modernization. So today we are here to talk about these 2 on the right. And as you will see, they're very closely linked. Now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, and she's going to provide you some background on these programs.
Thanks, Adair. So first I'll start talking a little bit about background on water project grants and loans, and then move to irrigation modernization. So water project grants and loans provide funding for water supply projects that meet both in-stream and out-of-stream needs and achieve public benefits in 3 categories: environmental, social, cultural, and economic. We'll talk more about those 3 categories later in the presentation. Water project grants and loans funding started in about 2016. We've issued 43 grants for about $57 million to date. And for the current biennium, the legislature authorized $10 million, and we plan on splitting that. So about $5 million will be awarded in 2024, and the remaining $5 million awarded in 2025. A variety of individuals or persons are available to apply for water project grants and loans funding. That includes persons as listed on the slide, nonprofit organizations, and the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. And the types of projects that are eligible for this funding include conservation, reuse, above ground and below ground storage, stream flow protection or restoration, water infrastructure, or other water projects that meet the three categories of public benefits. And now I'll talk a little bit about the irrigation modernization funding. So this funding is to provide funding for water supply projects to improve water use efficiency of irrigation systems on currently irrigated agricultural lands. It also needs to meet those three categories of public benefits. So federal funds became available for irrigation modernization, but they required match. During the 2023 session, the Oregon legislature authorized the irrigation modernization funds with the intent to help Oregon access these federal funds. Because the intent was to provide match for federal funds, you'll see one requirement for the irrigation modernization grants is that you have federal match. And we're using our existing program for efficiency to award these funds as quickly as possible to meet the need. The legislature provided $50 million in irrigation modernization funding, which split evenly would be $25 million per year. The Water Resources Commission has expressed an interest in potentially awarding more in the first year and will be providing them with more information to help them make that decision. If you have thoughts on this, please send us an email and we can pass them along to the Commission. So the same entities that can apply for water project grant and loan funds are eligible to apply for irrigation modernization funds. And eligible activities include piping or lining irrigation canals, ditches, or laterals, installing sprinklers or micro irrigation systems, upgrading existing infrastructure such as flumes or pipes, installing or upgrading pump stations, including variable speed pumps, installing measuring devices or soil moisture monitoring, purchasing irrigation scheduling software, installing SCADA systems, and upgrading turnouts. So for the application process is going to be the same for both irrigation modernization and water project grants and loans. So we'll start out with an applicant filling out your draft application. The application materials are all located on our website. And then we recommend that you have a pre-application conference with Water Resources Department staff. We'll talk more about many of these things as we go throughout the presentation. Applications for funding are due on January 17th at 5 p.m. Once we receive applications, OWRD staff will review them for eligibility and completeness. We'll open a 60-day public comment period, and those public comments will be provided to a multi-agency technical review team who will score and rank the projects. That information will be provided along with public comments to our Water Resources Commission in May or June. And then OWRD, once the Commission has made their decisions, will enter into a contract with recipients as part of our grant process. And I'm gonna pass it back to Adair, who will talk about some of the requirements for the funding.
Thank you, Lisa. So we just wanted to highlight some of the unique requirements that are associated with these funds. So the first one is cost match. This is different for each of the funds, so I'll go through them one at a time. For water project grants and loans, there is a cost match requirement of 25% for grants. So if your project costs $100,000, you would need to bring $25,000 to the table, and you could ask us for $75,000. The type of match that is allowed can be in kind. It can be your own organization, other state funds, federal funds. Really, we allow any type of match except for other OWRD funds. In terms of the timing, the match can be pending or secured at the time of the application. But in order to receive funds, if you are awarded a grant, you do need to have that match secured before we can release any funds. So be aware of that. Irrigation modernization is different. As Lisa noted, really the intent of these funds was to access federal funds that are available right now. So you must have specific federal match in order to apply for irrigation modernization funds. So that match includes Natural Resources Conservation Service, funds that are associated with an authorized watershed plan, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation Water Smart grants, or U.S. Environmental Protection Agency grants that are eligible to be on the Department of Environmental Quality's intended use plan. Similar to water project grants and loans, the status of your match at the time of the application can be pending or secured. And then also to receive funds, if you're awarded funds, the match must be secured prior to receiving funds. Another requirement that we want to make sure everyone is aware of, and this is for both water project grants and loans and irrigation modernization funding, is that if your organization is required to have a water management conservation plan or a WMCP, that plan must be submitted to OWRD and receive approval prior to you submitting an application. If you have any questions about whether you are required to have one or what the status is of your WMCP, please contact the email listed at the bottom of the slide, and it also has been placed in the chat for you. Wanted to talk a little bit about water measurement and permits. So this is, again, applies to both funding programs, water project grants and loans, and irrigation modernization. If you are awarded a grant, you will be required to measure and report water that is diverted and used. So you'll see in the application, we ask you to propose the method, timing, frequency, and location of those measurements. Then we will make the final determination if you are awarded a grant and provide a letter to you with your grant, letting you know what that final determination is. Regarding easements, permits, and any authorizations needed in order to implement your project, we do ask you for a list of those in the application, and you will be required to provide copies to OWRD either with the application or after the award. We understand you might not have all of those permits or easements yet, but it will be a condition that you provide those documents before we can release funds for activities that require those easements or permits. So for example, if you're doing construction and you need 3 permits, before we can reimburse you for any construction activities, we'll need copies of those permits. Okay, want to talk about some unique conditions for storage projects. This applies to water project grants and loans only, since irrigation modernization does not fund storage projects. But if your project is a water storage or aquifer recharge of newly developed water that is outside of the official irrigation season and does one or more of these 3 things. So if your project will impound surface water on a perennial stream, if it will divert water from a stream that supports state or federally listed sensitive, threatened, or endangered fish species, or if it will divert more than 500 acre-feet of surface water annually, your project will be required to have a seasonally varying flow prescription or an SVF. Additionally, if your project is above ground storage, there's a 25% in-stream release requirement. So let's talk about those 2 things a little bit more in depth. The seasonally varying flow. So again, if any of those 3 things were triggered by your project that I showed on the previous slide, then your project will need an SVF, which is stream flow that needs to remain in stream to protect ecological functions of the watershed while diverting water. OWRD will establish the SVF and determines the SVF prescription on the storage water right. We do this in consultation with ODFW and affected tribes. This all happens after grants are awarded. We want you to really be aware and understand this prior to applying, because it will add significant time to your project timeline. It takes a year or two to develop the SVF. We have additional guidance on our website. There's a one-pager that has more information about that, and that has been posted in the chat for you. Also, if this applies to your project, feel free to reach out. The second piece that was noted on that first slide, if your project triggers one of those three things and it's an above ground storage project, then 25% of the newly developed water must be legally protected in stream. And OWRD with ODFW will determine the timing of releases. And again, on that same webpage, we have more information on this requirement if this applies to you. Okay, so those are some of the unique requirements. Now I want to talk about application scoring. So as Lisa mentioned, both programs require that projects provide public benefit in three categories: environmental, economic, and social cultural. So we have a scoring criteria document on the website, on that same website that we've shown you. And this is the scoring criteria document that applies to both programs, water project grants and loans and irrigation modernization funding. We highly, highly recommend that you go through this document and you use it as you write your application. So let's talk a little bit about that public benefit section. You'll see in the application, there's a public benefit question section, and we will ask you 18 questions about the public benefits. So the first 6 questions are related to the economic public benefits of your project. So does your project increase efficiency or innovation? Does it increase economic activity? Does it create or retain jobs? Does it enhance infrastructure? Does it enhance the value of tourism, fishing, and recreation? And does it result in increased irrigated agriculture? And again, in that scoring criteria document, there's more information about what these questions mean, what we are looking for, and tips on the kinds of things the reviewers will be looking for. So the second section is related to the environmental public benefits that your project will have. So first, does your project result in a measurable improvement in stream flow? And in order to score points in this question, you must be proposing to legally protect water in stream. Does your project result in a measurable improvement in water quality or measurable improvement in groundwater levels? Again, note that keyword measurable when you're describing if your project has this public benefit. Does your project result in water conservation? That is, are you proposing to have the same result but using less water? Does your project result in increased resiliency to climate change? And does it address ecological limiting factors? The third public benefit category is social cultural, and these are the 6 questions that are asked for the social cultural public benefits. Does your project promote public health and safety and local food systems? Does it improve conditions for minority, low-income, tribal, or economically distressed rural communities? Does it promote recreation and scenic values? Does it contribute to the body of scientific data publicly available? Does it promote state or local priorities? And does it promote collaborative basin planning efforts? So those are the 18 questions that we are asking you to answer related to public benefits. And then I just want to talk a minute about who is reviewing these applications and who is scoring them based on these public benefits. And that is what we call the technical review team. They will be reviewing your applications and scoring this public benefit section. And this team is made up of our own department, Oregon Department of Agriculture, Business Oregon, Oregon Fish and Wildlife, Regional Solutions, Oregon Health Authority, and the Department of Environmental Quality. So a representative from each of these agencies will receive the applications and review them. They will then meet to discuss the applications for a full day meeting They will consider any tribal or public comments received, and then they will score the applications based on those public benefits. At the end of the meeting, they will have their funding recommendation. So what are they looking at when they score those public benefits? They're looking at both positive and negative impacts. They're looking at the likelihood of achieving the claimed benefits. Also, the change in conditions described. So you'll want to describe what is the situation now and what will the situation be after your project is completed. And then they're looking at supporting evidence or documentation. So just stating it will result in improved water quality without any more information will not result in many points or any points, because they need to see that evidence or documentation. So this is the scoring scale, and the scale is applied to each question. The scale is also in that scoring criteria document. So each question, the technical reviewers are looking at this scale. So if there's exceptional benefit, you would receive 12 points. This is very rare, and we don't expect many projects to get a 12 for any of these questions. And then it goes down from there. So a high benefit receives 6 points, medium benefit 3 points, a minor benefit receives 1 point. If there's no benefit, 0. And then there could be negative impacts, -1 or -3 if it's a medium negative impact. So this slide applies to water project grants and loans. Irrigation modernization is very similar with one difference. I'll go over that on the next slide. So again, there's 3 categories of public benefits. There are 6 questions in each public benefit category. And as I noted previously, there are a maximum of 12 points per question. So 6 times 12 is 72. So there's 72 available points in each category. And then there are also a couple of potential preference points. So up to 12 preference points for legally protecting water in stream, and up to 12 preference points for collaboration. So that's a total of 240 points available. For irrigation modernization, it is almost identical. Those first 3 rows are the same, but there's an additional 10 potential preference points for legally protecting stream flow commensurate with the amount required in ORS 537.470. And this is the allocation of conserved water statute. And there's specific language in there about how much is required if you're going through that program based on your public funding. So for irrigation modernization, there are 250 points available. And all of this, again, is spelled out in the scoring criteria document. So that was a lot of information about points, but what do those all mean? Essentially, there is a minimum score required for each category in order to be eligible to receive funding. So OWRD set this minimum category score of 7, and that signals that the public benefits are more than minor. Because as you recall, there are 6, let's just talk about economics. So in the economic section, there are 6 questions. If you received a point of 1 on each of those questions, which signal a minor public benefit, you would get a total score of 6 in the economic category, and that would not be enough to be eligible for funding. So by setting it at 7, that signals that you at least got a 3 or a 6 in 1 or 2 of the questions. So again, this is really important because you could have a project that has really high scores in economic and social cultural, but it doesn't have very much environmental benefit and you only score a 4, you would not be eligible for funding with this program, or either of these programs, I should say. Okay, so let's talk about how to apply. First, identify a project, determine the eligibility and fit. Hopefully this presentation today will help you with that. Fill out your application. Again, as Lisa mentioned, we do offer pre-application conferences. This is not required, but it is recommended, and I'll have a slide on that momentarily. So I'll give you a little more information. Use the application checklist to ensure the application is complete and signed. And then very important, submit by 5 p.m. January 17th, 2024. We cannot accept anything that's received after that time and date. We prefer email. If you could please send it to owrd.grants@water.oregon.gov. If you prefer to send it via snail mail, that is fine too, but please make sure it is received by that time. So all of the application materials and guidance documents are posted on our website. They're all under the Water Project Grants and Loans website. And it's that same website that we posted earlier, owrd.info/grants and loans will take you there. At the top are the application materials for Water Project Grants and Loans. I'll note there's the application itself, but there's also application instructions. And I'd highly encourage you to look at those instructions as you fill out your application, because it has information about each question. Underneath the Water Project Grants and Loans materials is the Irrigation Modernization funding application materials, and you'll see very similar. There's the grant application and then application instructions. We also have a lot of guidance documents, so I encourage you to look at those as well. I've already mentioned the scoring criteria document. We have an example grant agreement template posted for Water Project Grants and Loans, so you can see if you were successful, what a grant agreement would look like with OWRD. We are still waiting DOJ approval of our irrigation modernization template, so that one isn't posted yet, but it will be very similar to the Water Project Grant and Loan template, and we'll have that posted as soon as we can. We also have a grant budget procedures and allowable cost document that Lisa will talk about. And again, all of these are on that same website. If you keep scrolling under the irrigation modernization application materials, that's where they are. Let's talk about the pre-application conferences now. We've talked about this several times, I've mentioned it. So the purpose of these conferences is to answer your questions and identify additional information needed or issues with project eligibility and potentially connect you with other resources. So this is a great opportunity for you to get feedback from us on your draft application. In order to request an application, you need to submit your draft application, again, to that same website, owrd.grants. With this form that's on that same webpage, there's one for irrigation modernization and one for Water Project Grants and Loans. And this form shows you which sections of your draft application need to be filled out. We don't need you to have the entire application completed, but we need certain sections filled out. So if you send this form and your draft application with those sections filled out to us, we will then schedule a pre-application for approximately 2 weeks after we receive that draft. We will send it around to other folks in the agency, such as your water master. If it's a groundwater project, we'll send it to our groundwater section also to get feedback from them. And then we will set up a 90-minute meeting to go through your application, provide feedback, and answer any questions you might have. Okay, we're getting there. Section 6, application tips. We just have some application tips for you. The first is on the public benefits section. So again, this section is very important because this is the section that the technical review team is scoring. Again, there are 18 questions, and it's not expected that your project would have public benefits in all 18 questions. So I would encourage you to focus your attention on the questions where you think you can receive points. If you already know that your project is not going to result in improved quantity of, maybe just skip that question, say not applicable, or my project won't do this, and then really focus your time and effort on the questions that where your project will have public benefit. I'll also note that the project applications from the past few years are on our website. So if you would like to take a look and see how other folks have answered these questions, it might not be a bad idea to see both successful and unsuccessful grantees, how they have answered these questions. So you're going to want to clearly explain and link your project to the benefits, and you need to focus on the current project that you're proposing. So a lot of times you all are working on really big projects, and you might be proposing phase 2 of a 3 or 4 phase project. You cannot claim public benefits for something that happened in the past or maybe happened in phase 1. You also can't claim public benefits for things that will happen in the future. So just be careful on that and make sure that what you are stating and claiming in your application is related directly to this project that can include what your federal match will be doing. So between the OWRD funds and your match, your project will do X. And then be specific. So the example is construction will result in 3 new temporary jobs, and maintenance will create 2 permanent jobs in an economically distressed rural community. Again, document and provide evidence to support your claims. So if you have data or study results or a professional opinion and narrative of qualified persons, and then also quantify your benefits whenever possible, such as 25% of the conserved water will be placed in stream, or an economic analysis indicates the project will result in an additional 1 million in tourism revenue. Next, we want to talk a little bit about maps, because this is an area where we see a lot of incompleteness. And I want to just point out that there are specific requirements related to the maps. So we ask that you label the lat and long, the project area boundary, that you have a legend, a map title, a true north arrow, and then any properties that are impacted by your project need to be labeled with the tax lot numbers, and then also show the property boundaries. If you have a really large project, maybe you're doing piping for miles and miles, you may want to have an overview map and then split it into several maps to be able to show all of those properties and tax lot numbers. We know it can get pretty crowded if you have a lot of properties to show. But speaking of properties, this is another area, it's related, another area where we see incompleteness. So wanted to talk through this. So in the application, you will be asked to identify all the properties that will be impacted by project implementation. So in the water project grants and loans application, this is question 8. In irrigation modernization, it's question 9. And on the bottom left of the slide is the screenshot of what that table looks like. So we'll ask you for the tax map number, the tax lot number, the ownership type, the property of record, and what kind of activity is going to occur on the site. As mentioned previously, we need to see all of those properties labeled on the map. So when we do our completeness checks, we're going to be looking at that table in your application and then making sure that we can find all of those properties identified and labeled on your map. We're also going to be looking at the county parcel viewer to check that the property of owner that you have identified matches what is online. And then the third piece is that we need to see a landowner agreement form for all of the properties that you've identified in that table. And let me go to the next screen because it's a little bit different for water project grants and loans versus irrigation modernization for that landowner piece. So for water project grants and loans, we need to see documentation for all properties that you have permission to do the project on that property. The documentation must meet 2 statutory requirements. So the landowner is aware of and agrees to the proposed project, and the landowner is aware that monitoring information for the project is public record. If you use our landowner agreement form, the screenshot was on the previous slide and it's posted online in the application materials. If you use that form, that will cover those 2 statutory requirements. If you have an easement to do the work, that will cover the first one, but it doesn't cover the landowner is aware that monitoring information for the project is public record. So you still need to do that second piece. You would also need to submit the easement to us and still identify all of the projects or properties on the map and in your application. For irrigation modernization, we need the same documentation that you have permission to do the project, but it may be included with the application or it can be included after the grant agreement is signed. Additionally, the documentation does not need to include that second statutory piece that's required for water project grants and loans. So it does not need to include that the landowner is aware that monitoring information is public record. Let's talk a little bit about match documentation, because this is another area that we see incompleteness with. For all match, we do need to see documentation. So you would list it in the application itself, but then we need something additional. And that additional documentation for secured match needs to identify the dollar amount identified for the project. It should be the same dollar amount that you have listed in the application, and it needs to describe the work that will be accomplished through the match. If you have pending match, we also need documentation, and it should include the amount of match funding requested or anticipated, the project name, the date on which a future funding application will be or was submitted, the funding program from which funds are pending, and evidence that the project is eligible for the funding program identified. And again, as mentioned earlier, if you are awarded a grant, the match must be secured and you must provide documentation that it's secured before we can release any funds for the project. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa to talk about OWRD grants.
Thanks, Adair. So if you are awarded an OWRD grant, we will enter into a grant agreement with you. And those grant agreements, again, we have a sample of the water project grant and loan grant agreement on our website. It's going to be very similar to what we're anticipating for the irrigation modernization. So feel free to take a look at that. Our standard grant agreement includes the expiration date. There are sub-agreement contract language, procurement provisions, so requirements for procuring goods or services. We talk about compliance with laws, including prevailing wage, cultural materials, permits and regulatory approvals, the requirement to provide semi-annual progress reports and final reports. We include your project tasks as part of the statement of work, and then we also include the agreed upon project budget. So we do have 2 semi-annual reports that are due. They cover 6-month periods. So for January 1 through June 30th will be due on July 30th. And then the period from July 1 through December 31st is due January 31st. Your final report will be due shortly before your grant agreement expires. And then we do have post-project annual reports due for 5 years after a project is completed. And if appropriate, it would include water measurement information. So as an application tip, grant funds can be used to cover the costs associated with providing these reports. So remember to include them in your application budget. And that is for the semi-annual reports and the final reports. Your grant will be closed out before the post-completion reports. So that is not something we can provide funding for. And then we do have a document available on our website which outlines our budget procedures and allowable costs. And we really encourage you to become familiar with this document. All awarded funds with state dollars must adhere to generally accepted accounting principles, and any grantee must also make sure that their subcontractors or subgrantees are complying with these same principles. And the document again is posted online. So a few budget notes. You cannot use grant funds for equipment unless you request and receive prior approval for equipment purchases. These are very rarely approved. We also are not allowed to cover indirect or overhead costs. Indirect costs are usually charged as a rate and are included to cover things such as electricity, phone bills, office costs, and items that are required for your organization to do business, but are not related to the specific project work. And those costs are not allowed. Administrative costs are costs that are related directly to the grant, such as preparing fund request forms or preparing progress reports. And as I said earlier, these costs are allowed, but they can't exceed 10% of grant fee funds. And we can't reimburse for any expenses incurred before the date the grant agreement is finalized or signed by both parties, but we may be able to include those costs in your match. So please check in on that. OWRD provides funds on a reimbursement basis, and we don't provide you the money up front. And in order to receive funds, you must submit a fund request form with copies of your invoices or receipts for all of the expenses. So a couple of quick final application reminders. The application due date is January 17th. Please make sure that you have your application into us by 5 p.m. We do recommend that you submit that electronically to our email address listed on the slide and in the chat. We encourage you to submit that a little early. We have seen some applicants who missed the deadline because they were trying to send really large files that that had difficulty sending them in. So apply early. And then we do encourage you to participate in that pre-application conference that Adair talked about earlier. A reminder to provide evidence of supporting your public benefit claims and quantify the public benefits whenever possible. Make sure you're documenting and demonstrating collaboration so you get those additional points. And then we're available again at that email, the OWRD grants email, if you have questions after today's presentation. And then we are available here now for questions. We'd like to open the floor. If you have anything, you can either type it in the chat or raise your hand. We're happy to talk. So Denise is asking for water project grants and loans. If the district is required to have a WMCP, must the WMCP be approved by January 17th, or can it be submitted and in processed and improved at the time of the award in June of 2024?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I can take that one. It does have to be approved by January 17th, 2024. This is specifically in statute, so we don't have any flexibility on that.
Okay. And Kelly has their hand up.
Hi, yeah, I just submitted in the chat. I have a couple questions. First, you mentioned NRCS watershed plans as match. What other types of NRCS program funding can constitute as match?
I believe it's just the PL 566 funds.
Okay.
Do you have specific NRCS?
Yeah, like any of the local CISs or CSPs. There's a lot of various local programs available that they work with.
Yeah, we can look into that and confirm. Did you want to jump in, Kim? If you have specific names that is helpful for us to see if those are eligible, because the statute literally says NRCS funds associated with an authorized watershed plan. So we have to follow that. And so if we have the name of the funds you are looking to use, we can investigate and see if those are eligible.
Okay. Great. So maybe follow up offline individually on that.
Yeah, if you could send us an email with the
Sure.
specific funds, we can provide you an answer. That would be great.
Great. And what's that email?
Oh, owrd.grants@water.oregon.gov.
Okay, just the general one. Great.
Yep,
Okay.
that goes
And then
all.
my second question was, can an NGO apply on behalf of an individual for pass-through funds?
Yes, yes, like you would be,
Just to reduce the burden on an individual. So, we could be the applicant and help, have pass-through, just, I don't know, to reduce the burden. Because I think a lot of, this is a lot of work for an individual, in addition to their farm and ranching or whatever they might be doing. So, done that in other grant scenarios and it's worked well, but sometimes it's not permitted.
I want to confirm that you're talking about water project grants and loans and not the irrigation modernization funding. Either water project grants and loans, yes, that has happened a number of times. And sometimes we'll have the individual be a co-grantee, and we'll specify who is responsible for what different parts and who's getting the funding. And we can have a follow-up conversation to hear the specifics about your situation. With the irrigation modernization, it gets a little bit more complicated because of the federal match requirement, and so we'd want to make sure that the entity receiving the match, which makes the project eligible, is somehow connected to the project. And so we'll need to verify whether just like a letter, or we want once again want to have that co-grantee, where the nonprofit organization does all the paperwork and all that, but we know it's connected to that federal match, potentially going to the individual.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And then Matt asked if we anticipate the same due dates for the application in 2025. Adair?
I would say this time it's a little bit in flux. With water project grants and loans, historically, we offered this program once a year. We're now required to offer it twice a year. So we anticipate there'll be a second funding cycle this year in July. As for the future, as I said, it's kind of in flux as we work with this new funding requirement, and our grant staff is changing and growing. And so I don't want to commit to it. Let's see. And then for irrigation modernization projects, is there a funding limit on a single application beyond the overall 25 million funding bucket? No, we did not set a funding limit for irrigation modernization. I will note, I talked a lot about the project scoring, but one piece I didn't mention was the ranking. So after all of the projects are scored, then they are ranked based on their score. And then we will fund the top ranked projects that are eligible, that receive that minimum 7 in each category, until we run out of funding, until we reach that 25 million. So that's something to consider with how much you're asking for and where you think you might rank. Could my small private water company use its reserve funds for the match? Diane, for water project grants and loans, yes, but not irrigation modernization, since that requires the federal match. Any other questions? Thanks, Kim. And Kim just put in the chat how to subscribe to receive our messages. So I'd highly encourage you guys to do that. We don't send too many messages. You won't receive a message from us every week or anything. We just send messages to announce funding opportunities or to announce public comment periods. So highly recommend you subscribe for that. Well, if there are no other questions, I just want to say thanks again for coming today. We will post one of the recordings online if you would like to take a look at it later, and then please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thanks, everyone.